This man has an 8 to 10 year history of killing women all across the country.
An employee coming in just after 8 this morning made the horrible discovery. 4 employees of the Malibu Grand Prix stabbed to death.
She doesn't dispute that she stabbed her husband a staggering 193 times.
Harris's 16-year-old daughter witnessed her stepmother run the wheels of her Mercedes over her dad several times.
Police say the suspect may be responsible for the murders of at least 6 women.
Welcome back to another episode of The Evidence Room. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the murders of Jennifer Ertman and Elizabeth Pena. These were beautiful young girls, 14 and 16, both went to Waltrip High School, both were fast friends. But in June of 1993, they were walking home from a pool party. And like most teenagers, they were cutting it close to curfew, so they decided to take a shortcut. They lived in the Oak Forest neighborhood, and that shortcut was a set of railroad tracks that went through T.C. Jester Park over White Oak Bayou. They had the misfortune of coming across a group of gang members who had just finished initiating a new gang member. Joining us today is Detective Todd Miller, retired from the Houston Police Department. Thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
How long were you with the department?
Almost 34 years.
It's a very long career. And in homicide, I know that you see quite a bit of awful. This case, though, seemed particularly savage.
It really was. It was one of the worst cases of my young homicide career. I think I'd only been in the division maybe 8 or 9 months when this happened. And it was certainly one of the worst things I'd ever seen.
So the young girls, they were walking home from a pool party, not far from their own home. They go across this set of railroad tracks, which took them over the White Oak Bayou through T.C. Jester Park. Were they found that same night, or did this begin as a missing persons case?
No, it began as a missing persons case. The girls went missing when they didn't show up at home and by their curfew, and the parents reported them missing.
We called the parents Thursday night, 11 o'clock, and said they were about 10 minutes from the house, and they never showed up.
We know them. They wouldn't have just took off like that.
I know Jennifer, anytime her parents would be through, she'd call her like that. Even if they were on the street, she'd say, pull over, I need to call my parents to let them know where I'm at.
The next several days, everybody from the family was looking for the girls, and I think it was 3 or 4 days before they were actually ever found, before their bodies were located.
Where were they found?
There's a small wooded area that is located between the bayou, the railroad tracks that they were trying to cross.
To recover the bodies of what are believed to be 2 white females, possibly juveniles. The bodies found in some woods on the other side of White Oak Bayou, just north of the railroad tracks. The medical examiner told Channel 2 the bodies are so badly decomposed that identification at this point was impossible. Detectives were led to this wooded area shortly before lunchtime by an anonymous tip.
An anonymous call said there were 2 bodies in the wooded area near T.C. Jester and West 34th.
Is there any belief that the call came from someone who may have been involved in the foul play, or why did that person explain that they had found the bodies?
I have no idea. I don't know.
I think it's terrible. You can't even let your kids go anywhere. They're not safe to do anything.
Family and friends fear the bodies could be those of 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena and 15-year-old Jennifer Ertman, 2 girls who disappeared late Thursday night.
So how were the girls finally found? Because you said there was a bunch of people searching, so was it searchers or was it tips?
There was tips. There was tips that were coming in through 911 and to the to Crimestoppers as well, where somebody was trying to give the location of the girls to police through the Crimestoppers tip line, and through several phone calls, they were finally able to direct a patrol officer who did actually locate the girls in the woods, and then he called, of course, homicide right away, and the crime scene was secured, and then the investigation began. But it took several days from the time the murders happened before the girls were actually located.
So the person who called in had seen the girls, knew that they were dead?
He knew they were dead, and he knew the approximate location, and that was what he was trying to utilize to direct the police to find the bodies. He knew the bodies were there.
One victim was nude, the other partially clothed, their bodies badly decomposed. Many in the area fear they are 14-year-old Elizabeth Pena and 16-year-old Jennifer Ertman. The Waltrip High students had disappeared last Thursday after a party. They apparently walked home along these railroad tracks. This is an area residents know well and differently.
You can go out here in the middle of the night and there's people everywhere standing around, kids. Middle of the night, they ought to be in bed at home.
The gang is still back there. I don't go back there.
This park was so safe to us, you know? This was our park, you know? We grew up, it was generation by generation to hang out here, and no crack smoking.
Friends of the missing girls say despite other reports, there was nothing more than some teenage drinking going on. Others, though, believe the two dead bodies prove otherwise.
But they need to cut all that down, because, you know, more people could be back there than just them two girls.
Did it ever come out, I know Crimestoppers is anonymous, but did it ever come out during the trial as to who was making that call?
It did. Joe Cantu, one of the defendant's brothers, Peter Cantu was the, I guess you would call him the de facto ringleader of this gang that committed this crime, and his brother was the one that was making the phone calls, trying to give us the location and how to find the girls' bodies.
But his brother wasn't there when the murders happened?
No, his brother wasn't there. Joe had nothing to do with it. In fact, he became a very valuable witness in the case.
One of the things that's still in the Harris County Archive of Criminal Exhibits, which we call the evidence room, but it's all the exhibits from the cases, was archival news footage from all the stations, including us. I think one of the most gut-wrenching things I saw is the father was out there when they were found. Randy Ertman?
Randy Ertman. Mr. Ertman was there and understandably had a complete breakdown when his daughter was found.
Where's the kid at?
2 hours into the recovery process, the father of a missing 15-year-old girl tore through the crowd gathered at the tracks. The man was visibly and verbally in shock. Police had to physically hold him back to keep him from the bodies. That man left just before the remains of what are believed to be two teenage girls were wheeled away.
Did it impede the investigation, the length of time in between their disappearance and finding the bodies?
Well, of course, you know, 4 days in the Houston summer, it's hot, and yeah, the decomposition of the bodies certainly didn't help us preserve any of that evidence, but as far as it being trampled or anything like that, nothing along those lines.
Okay. One of the things that it came across is they were called the Black and White Gang. I don't even know if that exists anymore. I'd never heard of the Black and White.
I'd never heard of it prior to all this either.
So it was like one of these neighborhood kind of clique gangs?
I think it was more of a neighborhood clique gang than anything else, but they were certainly trouble. They had been involved in other murders prior to this one, so unbeknownst, of course, to law enforcement at the time, but it was certainly something that elevated them to the level of they should have been taken seriously.
They were going home. They're walking over that set of railroad tracks. And did the men see them? Did they see the men? I mean, or were they just walking by? I hate to almost use this phrase because it sounds so superficial, but wrong place, wrong time?
Well, I think it was a combination of the wrong place, wrong time, for sure, but the girls were just trying to get home. They were using the railroad bridge as a cut through to cut off a section of their walk home and get home a little bit quicker, and that just happened to be where the guys were hanging out drinking beer after just initiating this new gang member, and the girls once they were attacked, they couldn't get away. They were clearly outnumbered and outmuscled for sure.
There were what, 6?
Yeah, I think there were a total of six people there. Actually more in the very beginning. There were 2 other guys that whenever everything started and it was obvious that the girls were going to get raped, 2 of the guys actually left and they said they weren't down with it, the Roman brothers. They weren't down with it and they left. They got out of there. They actually also became valuable witnesses.
They left, but they didn't do anything to try and stop it.
They didn't do anything to try to stop it, and they also didn't call us or let us know anything either. They were witnesses after the fact and cooperated after the fact.
Based on the photos that are still in evidence and some of the things that are still in the archive, it appears this was not quick. I mean, based on what you're seeing still in the archive, it appears that these young ladies were tortured.
They were definitely tortured. I mean, they were beaten half to death. They were raped, brutally raped, every way imaginable, and ultimately strangled to death. They endured as much pain and horrific torture as a person could probably put up with.
They were killed so they couldn't ID who had attacked and sexually assaulted them, correct?
Correct. If they'd have been left alive, they could have identified everybody that was involved, theoretically, because these guys all hung out in that neighborhood.
So they were all from the area?
Yeah, more or less, yes. One of the defendants lived within a stone's throw of where the bodies were found, in the apartment complex there nearby.
So in all, you had 6 suspects: Peter Cantu, Raul Villarreal, you had Jose and Venancio Medellin, who were brothers, and then you had Derek Sean O'Brien and
Efrain Perez.
And Efrain Perez, thank you. So out of these 6, how did all 6 come to police's attention? How did that break in the case come?
So once we got the Crimestoppers tip and located the bodies, the person that was calling the Crimestoppers, we asked the Crimestoppers folks to help us out, and if he called back to give the informant our telephone number to try to get in touch with them to get more information. And that's and the tipster complied, and that's who it turned out to. When we found out, it turned out to be Joe Cantu, which was Peter's brother. And he agreed to meet with us, and actually he and his wife both met with us. And during that initial conversation, he laid out what had happened as far as he knew, based on what he had heard from the suspects, Peter, his brother, and the other 2 or 3 guys that had come home with Peter after the murder. And both Joe and his wife could see that the guys were covered with blood. They had scratches on them where the girls had fought back, and they also had jewelry that they had taken from the young ladies, jewelry and personal effects they had taken from the young ladies.
Obviously bothered by the presence of TV cameras, outright hostility marked the short walk from the city jail to the city courts this morning. Homicide detectives keeping a tight grip on 4 of 6 suspects taken before a judge to have their rights read to them for a second time. The first time came from homicide detectives as they rounded up suspects throughout the night. 6 suspects altogether, 5 adults and 1 juvenile. The juvenile, 14, maybe 15, was driven away by homicide this morning to be handled before juvenile authorities. All 6 suspects are being questioned for what are believed to be the murders of 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and classmate Elizabeth Pena, who just turned 16 a week ago. We're still waiting on the ME's report, but sources tell us it was their bodies that were discovered Monday in a densely wooded area near a Northwest Side apartment complex from where the girls were last seen walking home from a party late Thursday night. Detectives concede chances are they'd have no break in this case were it not for a tip from Crimestoppers.
This citizen involvement, it was a citizen calling us and letting us know some information that really caused us to be able to make these arrests. And so it was basically the community helping their police make the city safer.
So Joe and his wife, after talking it over, knew they had to do something. So that's when they started trying to lead the police to the bodies, which ultimately took 4 days. But they knew they had to come forward and say something. So it was through their initial statements that we were able to identify all 6 of those guys involved. And once we had all that information, then we started working with the DA's office and getting warrants. And then when we got all the warrants put together, and it was quite an undertaking. I think we had probably 12 or 15 people working on it around the clock. Once we had all the warrants, we executed them all pretty much simultaneously, and were able to get everybody scooped up at about the same time.
I noticed that it looked like several pieces of evidence were collected at the scene. How crucial did that become later on?
Oh, very crucial. There was a small piece of belt that had broken off, and the fragment of the belt was still at the crime scene, and we were able to recover the rest of the belt from one of the defendants, Derek Sean O'Brien, and that was entered into evidence, and those two pieces matched perfectly.
It was a red nylon belt, correct?
Red, kind of nylon,
so he kept
artificial.
It?
Yes. Took it home with him. And then after he was arrested and after he had confessed, he turned it over to us.
Did he give you any indication why?
Ultimately, the initial motive, I think, was rape. And once that started, things got progressively worse, and they realized they couldn't leave the young ladies alive for fear of getting caught.
How were they? Because some of the footage showed that Peter was pretty confrontational, at least with the media, kicking at the camera and all that. But when did that come?
That was after he had already confessed. One of the other investigators, Roy Swainson, and I were walking Peter to the municipal courthouse next door. Whenever the arrest is made and we put them in jail, there's still a ton of investigation that goes on. To find out that they had committed another murder some 6 months earlier. These same guys, 6 months earlier, had committed another murder, another equally horrific murder in Melrose Park, on top of everything that had been done to these young ladies, was just almost mind-numbing.
So that murder was unsolved until this came to light.
Correct.
So God knows what else they would have done had they not been caught for Jennifer and Elizabeth's murders.
Correct. And we would not have known about the murder. Her name was Patricia Lopez. We would not have known about her murder had we not received information that these guys were involved in that as well.
Why'd they kill her?
Same thing. They raped her. They kidnapped her. She had run out of gas on the north side of town, not too far from Melrose Park. And they offered to buy her gas if she would buy them beer, because they were underage and they couldn't buy the beer. She agreed, and then they promptly kidnapped her, took her to Melrose Park, brutally raped her, and then disemboweled her and left her dead. So it wasn't until we started looking at that case as a result of a tip that we found fingerprints from Derek Sean O'Brien on beer cans there, and ultimately DNA evidence from her body led us back to Jose Medellin, who was in prison by that time. It was just horrible, absolutely horrible.
A more subdued 18-year-old Peter Cantu was led into court this morning, studying contrasts from when Cantu graced our TV screens yesterday. The same goes for fellow 18-year-old Jose Medellin. He's the one who cursed at television cameras Tuesday. Cantu and Medellin both no-bonded, as were 18-year-old Derek O'Brien and 17-year-olds Efrain Perez and Raul Villarreal. All 5 teenagers, as well as the 14-year-old juvenile, have confessed. They kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 16-year-old Elizabeth Pena.
I think that these girls happened along and that they were in positively the wrong place at the wrong time.
Detectives describe the killings as a crime of opportunity. They stress what happened to the girls was not part of a gang initiation that had taken place only hours before.
We feel like as they happened by, these guys saw their chance to do what they did, and they did.
Did Houston have a big gang problem?
You know, every street cop that was working back during those times knew that there was a gang problem in the city. The administration, for whatever reason, really didn't address it or confront it head on at that time. This case, I think, changed that to the point where, given the nature of the crime, and the whole gang part of it, from beginning to end, they really couldn't deny any longer that there was a gang problem in Houston. And I think that it helped get the department to start confronting gang issues and gang problems, at least head on. I think the gang division was formed shortly after this incident. And then the beginning of sharing information with other agencies also to try to address the gang problem in Houston.
Young pallbearers fight back tears as friends and family, mother and father, gather to bid farewell to Elizabeth Pena. The 16-year-old and her 14-year-old friend Jennifer Ertman were brutally raped and murdered on their way home one evening last week.
They were real outgoing, nice, funny. They were real friendly with everyone.
6 teenage gang members are charged with the crime.
I don't even think death is severe enough for them.
Certainly this will put more of a watchdog effect on gang activity in Houston.
But many of the teens who went to school with these girls fear even their deaths won't stop the growth of gangs.
I don't think they'll think twice about it.
Other gangs will probably just get feed off of this and get more powerful. They got to be harder because what they did, other gangs will probably get stronger.
You know, more violent, I guess.
I think it is sad because it needs to stop.
Jennifer's mother calls on parents to pay more attention to rearing children. The Ertmans called reporters to praise police for swift arrests and to thank the community.
The respect shown by the people of Houston towards Jennifer makes us very proud.
Jennifer was entombed yesterday in the same cemetery where another hearse arrives for Elizabeth's burial today.
Because God has chosen to call our sister Elizabeth pristine from this life to itself, we commit her body to the earth.
As they were in life, the 2 girls will be close in death.
I don't see why it happened.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
For some who loved these girls, it's hard to forgive. Ken Kaltoff, Channel 2 News.
As has been stated before, we believe this was a crime of opportunity. We think that these girls happened along and that they were in positively the wrong place at the wrong time. And we feel like as they happened by, these guys saw their chance to do what they did, and they did.
Ertman Pena has given a confession in regard to both of the complainants in this particular case, that both of the complainants were sexually assaulted. And we're not sure if both of them were strangled. We don't have the autopsies yet.
You said O'Brien confessed, you said Cantu confessed. I read Ephraim's statement, Ephraim Perez's statement, laying out what happened to the young ladies. Did any of them ever express remorse for what they had done?
Not that I know of. I didn't obviously take all of them. I took Derek Sean O'Brien's confession and one of the other defendants as well. But like from what I was told, Peter never expressed any remorse.
A Houston homicide detective told jurors this morning that defendant Peter Cantu was nonchalant yet boastful when he confessed to the crime, saying, "We killed the girls." The girls, Elizabeth Pena and Jennifer Ertman, were savagely assaulted and killed in June of 1993. Their bodies had been abandoned for 4 days near White Oak Bayou. Prosecutors say Cantu led the attack as part of a gang ritual and then ordered that the girls be killed. Jewelry belonging to the victims was shown to jurors today. A crime scene investigator says necklaces, rings, and other items were recovered from Cantu's residence. More than 150 people, many of them students from the girls' school, packed the courtroom. Attorneys for Peter Cantu put no one on the stand during the trial, saying during closing arguments that Cantu did commit rape, but did not intentionally take the lives of anyone. A Houston homicide detective told jurors this morning that Cantu boastfully told authorities last June, "We killed the girls." In his confession, Cantu said about Pena, "She dropped to her back. We checked for a pulse." Then he said her neck and Ertman's were stomped. "We did this to make sure they were dead. We didn't want to be identified."
I can't believe he just sat there and said everything, you know? He just everything, just like it happened. Like he didn't care.
Can't understand how another human being could do that, you know? Just so brutal, you know? I just can't understand.
How was O'Brien?
O'Brien was the same way. Nothing at all. Very matter of fact when he was talking about the case, about what happened and how it happened. Almost robotic, not to the point of showing any emotion or expressing any sorrow at all.
Testimony is pinpointing 18-year-old Peter Anthony Cantu as ordering the murders of two teenage girls, 14-year-old Jennifer Ertman and 15-year-old Elizabeth Pena. A 14-year-old gang member now serving 40 years for his part in the crime described in detail how both girls, crying and begging to go home, were repeatedly sexually abused by fellow gang members, then murdered. Prosecutors told the jury the girls were choked to death using hands, a belt, a shoelace, and finally a foot. Prosecutors say the girls' jewelry was taken as a trophy. Earlier, another gang member who did not take part in the murders testified that Cantu and the others had just completed a gang initiation rite when the girls walked by. The girls' families listened to the testimony, but are asking a victims' rights group to speak on their behalf.
Obviously, nothing less than a death penalty will be sufficient for the brutal, horrendous death of Jennifer Ertman and Melissa Pena. And personally, I think the death penalty is too good for what happened.
One teenager testified that he and his brother left early that night, telling the jury you could tell that the gang had the devil in them. Rod Regan, Channel 2 News.
Derek Sean O'Brien lived in the apartment complex immediately adjacent to where the little area, the wooded area where the bodies were found. So it may have been the red pickup truck may have been parked in front of his apartment.
So he literally passed by where those bodies were every day. I mean, you could probably see
while they were decomposing in the woods. He, yes, was right there. Right there. I mean, when he walked out of his apartment, he was a stone's throw away from where they were laying there for 4 days.
But I've got to imagine, just as a person, that's got to just hit you in the gut that here is another person talking about this horribly vicious act and not showing any remorse for it.
Yeah, it's hard. You have to wonder what made what made people like that. You know, for these 6 guys to get together and go through with an act this horrific, what caused them to be that way, where not a one of them would stand up and say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is wrong. We got to stop this."
I also saw that Venancio Medellin actually testified against the others.
Yes.
He was the youngest, though, wasn't he? Like 14?
He was a juvenile, yes. He was 14 years old, very young.
That's
very
another
young.
thing, 14 years old to be involved in that.
I mean, yeah, that's just absolutely incredible. Same age as one of the girls, though. I mean, one of the young ladies was only 14 years old as well. So, yeah, it's when you start thinking about how young that really is, that is absolutely amazing.
We, the jury, find defendant Peter Anthony Cantu guilty of capital murder charged in indictment signed by the foreman of the jury, Stephen Provisos.
19-year-old Peter Cantu smiled and smirked after the verdict was read. Observers in the courtroom, many of them friends of the girls, wept The only reaction from family members came outside as the fathers of the murdered girls embraced. Attorneys on both sides would not comment as 4 other related cases have yet to be tried. Others who had been watching the proceedings couldn't wait to react.
I just found this to be truly remarkable, and I'm glad to see that this jury believes in swift and expedient justice.
Ertman and Pena were savagely assaulted last June. Prosecutors say Cantu led the attack after a gang initiation. His confession was entered into evidence this morning. Yet defense attorneys say their client was guilty of rape, not capital murder.
He admitted that as far as Miss Ertman goes, that while she's laying on the ground after being struggled, he put his foot on her throat and applied pressure for a couple of seconds. So he's guilty of the capital murder that he's been found guilty of. And now he'll be punished for it.
How do you feel about Peter being charged with this offense?
I feel very hurt, and I don't believe what's going on. I don't know what to believe, because I don't think he could have done it. I see him getting mad with a person that keeps picking on him or whatever and defend himself, but I don't see him do anything like that.
One of the things that surprised me is in Peter Cantu's case, you can see when they read the guilty verdict, he kind of smirked.
He was cocky throughout the whole interview process. You could see the cockiness when he was kicking at the cameraman, and even during the trial, when the trial was going on. I think that if you paid attention to him, he really didn't have much use for any of it, and it seemed to be very.
So this is a person who just didn't care about life, anybody's life.
That's a good way of putting it. He didn't seem to care one way or the other about his life or the 2 young ladies that were brutally murdered and raped. He just didn't care. 2 things that really came from this case that advanced, in my opinion, victims' rights was the victim impact statement. It's commonplace now when family members of victims stand up in court and they get to say exactly the pain that's been caused to their family and the pain that will never stop, never go away, even after the trial is over. That started in this case. Before this case, victims and family members could not give a victim impact statement in open court directly to the defendant or anything along those lines. And it was through Mr. Ertman that now that's become, like as you said, quite commonplace in almost all murder trials.
This afternoon, Jennifer Ertman's father took the stand with his voice quavering. Randy Ertman described how frantic he'd been the night Jennifer didn't come home, how he'd searched for her the next day, and how he'd lost control when her body was finally found. Asked what effect her death had had on his life, he told the court, quote, "No more birthdays, no more Christmas. The worst part is no more children. I'll never have another child. That was it." Elizabeth Pena's mother told the jury her daughter's death has devastated her family. She said her last words to her daughter were, "I love you," to which Elizabeth replied, "I love you too."
Another thing that came out of it is it was one of the main driving forces, I know not the only one, but one of the main driving forces that got the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to change policy and allow family members of victims to witness executions.
Prior to this case, family members were not allowed that opportunity, which, looking at it from what happens in modern times today, it's hard to believe that was even the case, but it was. They were denied that right. And so Mr. Ertman, again, I think was the driving, Mr. Ertman and the other family members were the driving force to get that change, that policy changed.
Family and friends gathered one more time to remember. The victims' rights organization, Justice for All, dedicated the crosses to the girl's memory.
Nobody had to go through what she did, and that's sad because I miss her a lot.
It's evident by the turnout here, the girls had many friends, though their deaths occurred a year ago. To those who knew them well, it seems like only yesterday.
It was something that was necessary to do, but the families really didn't, I don't think really wanted it as public as it was, but I'm very grateful for everybody that I see here.
One person here said the crosses represent a lasting reminder of Elizabeth and Jennifer. And how could they forget the wooded area where their young lives were suddenly cut short? Glenn Boyd, Channel 2 News.
All 6 originally got the death penalty, but only 3 were executed. From what I read, Medellin and O'Brien actually did finally say, I'm sorry. That was part of their final statement for execution.
Yes.
I actually witnessed Peter Cantu's execution in 2010, I believe. Nothing at all. And I remember the families afterwards, to them, it was a testament to just how much of a coward he was. That even in the end, he couldn't say the most basic thing, I'm sorry.
Because I don't believe he was sorry. I just don't believe he was sorry. I think he had a I don't give a damn attitude, and that went right with him to the grave. He was one of those kind of people that when you look at him, if you can say, I can just see pure evil in people, he'd be one of those people I would say that about. And there aren't many I've seen. There's a few, but he's definitely one of them.
All 6 got the death penalty, though, but the other 3 were under 18, so I believe that in the interim, the Supreme Court made that ruling to where if a person is under 18 at the time they commit even a capital offense, they can't get the death penalty.
Right. The 17-year-old defendants, the law was changed to exclude them from possibility of receiving a death sentence. The 17-year-olds' sentences were commuted to life without parole.
Venancio Medellin, Jose's brother, actually, he never got a death penalty because he had testified against the others and
he had gotten a 45-year sentence or something along those lines.
40.
Venancio Medellin has been behind prison walls for the better part of 2 decades for his part in a crime breathtaking in its brutality. Now eligible for parole, victims' relatives are trying to ensure he stays behind bars. Medellin was sentenced to 40 years in prison at the age of 14. While he's been there, 3 of his co-defendants have been executed. 2 others are serving life sentences. But Medellin is now up for parole.
I want this man to be in prison the rest of his life. I'm sorry I said man. I want that piece of crap to die in prison. And I'll do whatever I have to do to make sure he stays in prison. Would you want him to be your neighbor? Would you want him living next door to you? He's a murderer and rapist. And Jenny Elizabeth, they didn't have a choice. He had a choice. He could have walked away, but he didn't.
Randy Ertman and his wife met with a member of the Board of Pardons and Paroles for about half an hour today. This is the 4th time Medellin has been up for parole. Each time, Randy and Sandra Ertman are forced to relive their daughter's horrible death.
When you wake up in the morning, you look at your daughter's picture and you got a hole in your heart. I don't know if it ever gets better.
It's been almost 20 years, but at a monument in the park where the girls died, people still leave stuffed animals and flowers to ensure they're not forgotten. The parole board will make its decision sometime in the next 2 months. Phil Archer, KPRC Local 2.
It's amazing to me that these people may one day be back out on the street. Now, just because you're eligible for parole doesn't mean you're going to get parole, but it seems just incredible to me that these 3 may actually one day be free.
It is incredible to think of along those lines, given the horrific nature of this crime and as bad as it was, that they may actually get out of prison. I would hope that the parole board would take the totality of the circumstances into consideration and think about that 20 minutes or so that those poor young ladies went through before granting anybody parole, and ask themselves, would it be justified?
Well, I know Venancio has come up a few times for parole because he got the 40-year sentence for aggravated sexual assault, and he's been denied each time. And again, his next review is in 2033. So he has been denied a few times. Thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk about this case, because I do think it's important for people to remember the good that this led to.
I agree, and you're very welcome. I really think there was a lot of things that this case changed for the positive, I think, for victims.
All Thank you, and good luck to you, and thank you again for coming on the show. That concludes this week's episode of The Evidence Room. Next week, we're actually hitting the road with our former colleague, Phil Archer. We're going to take you down to Galveston, and we're going to show you how a New York real estate heir wound up living at a boarding house as a deaf-mute woman, who then killed his neighbor, dismembered the body, and tossed it into Galveston Bay. But that was far from the only crime Robert Durst was accused of committing. We're going to take you through all of that when The Evidence Room streams next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. And you can catch up on all past episodes of The Evidence Room on our KPRC2 Plus app. Have a good rest of the week.